Listen to this retelling and reflecting on John 20, verses 19 to 23. The disciples trembled in fear behind locked doors as the sun set on that first Easter.
We often do not perceive the most transformative possibilities of our lives because we too are afraid of change, of loss, even afraid of healing.
Jesus broke through the barrier of their hiding place and stood among them.
Even when we long for our burdens to be lifted, we become so accustomed to carrying them that we cannot imagine being released from them.
Jesus greeted the disciples with the word, "Peace be with you."
We sometimes find it difficult to embrace peace in our lives because they're in so much upheaval, or our hearts are grieving, or because we simply are aware of the world's aches.
Knowing what they needed, Jesus extended his pierced palms and his stabbed side.
What evidence do we require to believe our lives can experience resurrection from a power higher than our own? What helps us trust and believe?
They rejoiced as they recognized their friend, their leader, their solace and redeemer.
When we search for help and hope, do we rejoice when we see the first possibility of transformation? Do we rejoice along the way to healing?
Again, Jesus offered his peace and said, as he was sent by God, he sends them.
Even in the midst of our own turmoil, we can find the courage to go where we are sent for healing for ourselves and to go where others are in need of our witness.
Jesus breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit."
The gift of Holy Spirit power is always with us and within us to lead and guide and sometimes cajole and awaken to all the possibilities for renewed life. Let us respond to this good news. We see in the example of Christ how to forgive others and how to release our own woundedness. We open ourselves to the freedom, release, and peace that comes through forgiveness. We forgive ourselves and we forgive others. This is the word of hope for people who are longing for it. Thanks be to the living God.
So those of you who aren't liturgists may not be aware that Jeff usually sends a prompt to guide the liturgist to something he thinks is important. This week, he sent a prompt that to make sure I explained about Ezra. And I admit that the first thing that came to my mind was, what is Ezra doing in Nehemiah's book? So here's what I discovered. Nehemiah and Ezra were two prophets who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era. Modern scholars consider the two books to be a single work. That's why they're both in here, providing the only stories we have for the period after the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon. And in this passage, the prophet Ezra is praying as he leads a ceremony celebrating the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and the restoration of religious life to the land. And you saw the distress of our ancestors in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land, for you knew that they acted insolently against our ancestors. You made a name for yourself, which remains to this day. And you divided the sea before them, so that they passed through the sea on dry land. But you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into mighty waters. Moreover, you led them by day with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light on the way in which they should go. You came down also upon Mount Sinai, and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known your holy Sabbath to them, and gave them commandments and statutes and a law through your servant Moses. For their hunger you gave them bread from heaven, and for their thirst you brought water for them out of the rock. And you told them to go in to possess the land that you swore to give them. The word of the Lord.
I began my sermon last week by quoting the Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber. And I want to begin my sermon today by offering that same quote again. I want to do that because I think she has summed up in two sentences the core of Christianity, and she is pointing us as well to what this worship series during the 50 days of Easter is all about. Here's what she said. The Christian faith, while wildly misrepresented in so much of American culture, is really about death and resurrection. It's about how God continues to reach into the graves that we dig for ourselves and to pull us out, giving us new life in ways both dramatic and small. In the course of this worship series, we will get a chance to hear both from others and to discover within ourselves the ways that we dig graves for ourselves and the ways God reaches into those graves to pull us out, giving us new life. And our theme for this week is release. Today we look at how resurrection comes in the form of release. So let me start with our reading from Nehemiah, that strange reading where Ezra is praying and preaching simultaneously, it seems to me. The historic setting for the book, as Joyce said, is the return from the Babylonian exile. It's about 70 years since the leaders of the kingdom of Judah were removed after the Babylonian Empire conquered the country. The leaders, the intellects, the learned certainly were all removed, and probably a great portion of the population. That was the Babylonian method of conquering. So it's 70 years later. So it's the descendants of those who were exiled who are finally being allowed to return and to reestablish themselves as a people and a nation. And key to their identity as a people and a nation is the Exodus story, the story of God intervening in history to bring the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and into the land they thought of as promised. So in our reading, Ezra, the high priest, reminds the people of that story, of the story of God intervening. It makes sense that he would look to that story because the Exodus story and the return from exile story are very, very similar in themes. The Hebrew people were released from the bondage of slavery and led through the desert, finally arriving at their so-called promised land. A people held for generations in exile had been released and allowed to return to a land they had never been in, but a land that they nonetheless considered promised to them. God's hand is at work in the Exodus. God's hand is at work in the release from exile. The tasks of becoming a self-governing people are the same for the people of the Exodus and for the people returning from exile. In both stories, God is granting a newness of life, a resurrection to a vast number of people simultaneously, to a whole nation. The people who experienced resurrection in the reading from John is much smaller. In fact, at first glance, the number is 1. Jesus. It's Easter Sunday. It's the night of Easter Sunday, and Jesus is the resurrected one. He's the central character. He's the one who has literally risen from the dead. And so as we see, he's not the only one who has experienced resurrection. It's evening, the day of Jesus' resurrection. Mary Magdalene has had her dawn encounter with the resurrected Jesus. She's gone and told the disciples about it, and now evening has come, and the disciples have locked themselves away. John says, where they had met. They've locked themselves away where they had met. Diana Butler Bass interprets this to mean that they had locked themselves away in the upper room where Jesus had washed their feet and where they had shared a Last Supper with him. They are back in the room where Jesus gave them a new mandate: love one another. But the doors are locked. They're afraid. John says the doors were locked for fear of the Jews. Bass writes about this too. In recent decades, many liberal theologians and mainline preachers have gone to great lengths to minimize the anti-Semitism of John's passion narrative, a story full of references to the Jews. This year, my own pastor sent out a note to the congregation explaining, rightly, that during Holy Week we'd hear texts that mention the Jews, but those references really mean the Jewish authorities who collaborated with the Romans. The clarification is now fairly commonplace in mainline churches, which is a very good thing. Not all Jews, only certain enemy sympathizers. Thus, the opening words of Easter evening, the doors were locked where the disciples had met for fear of the Jews. That last phrase is read softly, skipped over, or mentally reinterpreted to hear for fear of Jewish authorities. We want to move on quickly, not to dwell on that problematic phrase. Much better to put the emphasis on the end of the sentence. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Phew, we can breathe. But what if the reader, in this case at least, really meant for fear of the Jews? Why wouldn't the author say fear of Pilate's men or Roman soldiers or the folk that the disciples were afraid of? There are plenty of bad actors they might have feared. Why for fear of the Jews? This is particularly odd when you remember that all the disciples locked in that room were Jews. Were they afraid of their own people? Were they afraid of themselves? Are you ever afraid of yourself? I know there have been times I've been afraid of my grief. I've been afraid that if I really go deep into my grief, that I will never surface again. I know there are times when I'm afraid of my own anger, afraid that if I really felt it, I couldn't control it and it would explode destructively. Are you ever afraid of yourself? My older sister celebrated a 30th anniversary last month. She told me I could share this story. Which is important because I'm going to reveal some stuff about her. The 30th anniversary of her sobriety. Yeah. As I looked at the John passage during our Monday morning Bible study, and yes, that was a shameless plug for the Monday morning Bible study. As we looked at the John passage during the Monday morning Bible study, I wondered if my sister was ever afraid of herself because she was afraid that she might drink again. And so I had a conversation with her this week. I asked her if she's ever afraid of herself that she might drink again. And Sally, my sister, said the fear she has of herself is not that she'll drink. The fear she has is that she'll act like a jerk. That confused me too. So let me explain. We've all been in situations that we can't control. And Sally's old script, a script that goes back to her childhood, tells her that when she faces something she can't control, she needs to act out in a way that she subsequently looks back at and says, oh, well, I was acting like a jerk. And then because she's acted like a jerk, she feels shame. And then she doesn't like feeling the shame, so she wants to anesthetize it. And her anesthetic of choice is alcohol. So her fear is not so much that she'll drink again as that she'll act like a jerk and end up drinking. Thus, Sally's fear of herself takes the form of fearing that she'll act like a jerk. Her words. The first 3 steps of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are sometimes paraphrased as, I can't, God can, I think I'll let him. More formally, they are, and I'm using the traditional AA language, even though it is a little archaic and it genders God as masculine. Step 1, we admit that we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. Step 2, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Step 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. The AA Big Book, as it's called, offers a specific prayer to help ground this 3rd step. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help, of thy power, of thy love, of thy way of life. When I told my sister that the theme for today's service was release, she immediately thought of that prayer. It's that line in the prayer, relieve me of the bondage of self. The line could easily have been, release me from the bondage of self. Sally says that her sobriety started by her thinking her partner's alcohol use was the problem. And eventually, she acknowledged that maybe her own alcohol use might be the problem. But the breakthrough came when she acknowledged that she was the problem. Not the alcohol, she told me. I am the problem, so I need to change. And I can't change me. God can. Those are the first 3 steps. She told me that steps 4 through 12 in her experience are the letting God change her. I asked Sally what release from bondage of self looks like to her now, and she says it's about not having undue attention on herself, and she does that by helping the next guy. Again, her words. In that action, the action of helping the next guy, she discovers the wisdom and truth in one of the lines from the prayer of St. Francis. It is in giving that we receive. The fear of the Jews that John says the disciples were feeling that night may have been a bondage of self. They locked the doors to keep others out, to keep themselves in, and Jesus got through the locked doors anyway. And when he did and stood among them, he shook his finger at them and scolded them. No, he stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And after he showed them the wounds, he said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I send you." Be released from this tomb. Be released from the tomb of exile. Be released from the tomb of fear. Be released from the tomb of bondage to self. As the Father sent me, so I send you. Go and help the next guy. In this time of quiet reflection, I invite you to think about the resurrection power of release. As this look at the resurrection power of release unlocked one of your resurrection stories, how might you speak up and share this good news?